trying to train him. This is Kipling's work up here.
Oh my goodness sakes.
Yeah.
I didn't tell you that I've been so looking forward to this that I showed up last Friday with my charcuterie board and I had it all set up.
Yeah.
And I'm like texting Jody going, where is everyone?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, not only was it the wrong
early.
week, it was the wrong night because we do the Saturday symposiums on Saturday.
It was Saturday.
Oh.
Well, Kathy has her blonde moments too.
Well, don't say you lived up on
It's not really a blonde moment. It's that I was so excited about
Well,
this
I'm
talk.
sorry. I should have been more sensitive
Punctual.
and
A week early.
and considerate.
One of my favorite poems is Recession. One of my all-time favorite poems, Recession.
Oh yes.
Lest we forget.
That's quite a set you've got there.
Well, that was donated. Parishioners have donated a lot of the sets.
Goodness.
We're getting there.
Yeah, I could covet that set if I.
We got a
let
ways to
myself,
go.
You know, so.
Come on in, everybody. Find a seat.
And we're keeping the intro. going.
Absolutely.
Brief. They know me.
Come on, Gary. By the time I did one, you take a photo, Mike. I was looking through the children's book.
I'm sorry.
I was looking through the children's book.
Yes.
And I noticed that.
Come on in, Marianne. Find a seat. Find a seat.
Dramatic theology. And I said, that's wonderful.
Where?
In the children's book. Father Mike says, no,
We're partners. We're an Advent.
We can give that to the nursery and they can check their teeth on that.
There you go.
Okay. All right.
If they knew how nervous I've been all day,
Oh,
they would come
goodness, really?
Thank you. I know you do. But you know, nerves are good.
All right. Well, everyone, move in into the center as you're able. There's a chair over there, Mrs. Dahl, by your husband. If you'd like to take that. Bobby, there's chairs here in the middle. You don't have to sit in the back. Or Bob, come on in. Everybody, come on in. Well, as everyone's trickling in, I'm going to go ahead and get us going. Again, thank you, everyone, for coming to our third and final symposium for this fall. I guess we could say in Texas. Are we in winter? Is this winter in Texas? For the end of this calendar year. And so I'm very thankful for everyone who's come out to support the symposiums, and I think we've gotten off to a good start this year. And there's going to be a whole other season next year, so please look at the website, the e-news. We've got some great lectures and ideas being formulated for us next year, so look to continue this into the next year. As you know, we're trying to not only gather for fellowship and to enjoy one another and have this be a place for all people to come, and not just members of the church, but people to come in and engage and make friends and enter into interesting conversations. We're trying to re-engage the culture, but more importantly, we're trying to repair some of the things that have kind of been lost, and we're trying to fill in the gaps and breach that which is, or that is which has been breached over the many years, and we find ourselves today not really knowing who we are, where we are, or why we are in this culture. So these conversations are meant to not only make us think, but to think about good things. Think about good, true, and beautiful things, in particular within the Western cultural tradition. And so that's what we're trying to do. So tonight, I'm happy to have my friend. I'm supposed to keep the introduction short. So shorter than Frank Bridwell, which went on forever, because I love Frank. But most of you know Reverend Father Tom Smith. He's a dear friend to me and his wife Kathy, to Jody and I, but also our extended family. He taught two of our children in high school. has been very influential in my life in the priesthood as I was coming up as a postulant and learning, so to speak, how to become a man worthy of being called a deacon and a priest. And Father Tom has been a very special friend to me these many years. So he's an Anglican. He's a priest. He's one of the best preachers I've ever heard preach. He's a musician. He's an artist. He's a husband, father, and grandfather. And I want to welcome tonight Father Thomas Smith.
Love you. Now, thank you. I'm very honored to be here. And I'm very thankful for your eagerness to be here with us. My subject tonight, the title is stolen from A.N. Wilson, who wrote this book, which I want to recommend to you. It's called God's Funeral. And it's on the demise of faith in Victorian Edwardian England. And I've read it several times. And Wilson is an engaging writer. And I don't know if you know Wilson's biography of C.S. Lewis, but Wilson was a Christian as a young person and then lost his faith for many, many years and was an open atheist. And he is writing as an agnostic atheist in this book. In the past 10 years, he's come back to Christian faith. And his most famous recent thing is a documentary on the life of C.S. Lewis that you can get on Amazon Prime. And that's narrated by A.N. Wilson. And you can tell that he is obviously a Christian believer again. And of course that's caused tremendous controversy in the UK and around the world because he's an internationally known and admired writer. So that is a fascinating book. If you're fascinated in literary history and literary biography, which I am and have been all my adult life. Now, what is interesting is that Kipling doesn't figure in this book at all. But of course, you can't get everybody in. But I think you'll be fascinated with this. So the whole idea of God's Funeral is the demise of Christian faith during the late Victorian and Edwardian era. So this is the last years of Victoria, the years of Edward VII, and down to the First World War, actually. And those years coincide with the years of Rudyard Kipling, Joseph Rudyard Kipling, who was born in 1865 and died in 1936, and was renowned as a writer and loved and adored as a writer all over the world, for that matter. And certainly all over what was then the empire, the British Empire. And I'll talk some about Kipling's life in terms of general biography. He was born in Bombay, now Mumbai, India, in 1865. His parents were called English Indians or Indian English or Anglo-Indians, as all of the English in India at the time were. His father was a sculptor and a potter and was the head of the art school there in Bombay. His family, therefore, was enmeshed in the arts from very early time. At age 5, he and his younger sister were sent to England, as was the custom at the time, to be educated, and also out of fear that they might contract the many diseases that were common in India at that time. I'll be talking about that childhood at length tonight, so I'm not going to dwell on that. After his adolescence, he was unable to enter Oxford because of his bad grades. He had been a poor student. He had had a poor education. And so he was not able to enter Oxford. His family were not able to pay for Oxford or Cambridge. And so his father arranged for him to get a job as a journalist with an Indian Bombay newspaper. And it was as a journalist that he began to write. And thank God that he didn't get an Oxbridge education because he began to write. And you know, in our own American canon, people like William Manchester and Pete Hamill and others are our best writers, and they all were journalists first. And as Mark Twain said, get your facts right and then mess with them. And so that's what journalists are supposed to do, whether they do that nowadays. So he had a career as a journalist. Now, he traveled the world and ended up in America and ended up marrying an American woman. And they lived in Connecticut. They had 2 children there and then a son. And tragedy struck when the oldest child, a girl named after her father, Josephine, after Joseph Rudyard, she died of pneumonia. He never recovered from that. And the family moved to England, settled in Sussex, in a marvelous house. There's an outstanding documentary that tours that house on YouTube. That was a house built in 1634. And just everything, if you love that kind of Englishness, that's the quintessential English house. So if you like that, you'll enjoy that very, very much. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first Englishman ever to be awarded that prize, in 1907 at the age of 41. He was the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. So that tells you something about him. Henry James, who was no mean judge of character, said of Kipling, Kipling strikes me personally as the most complete man of genius, as distinct from intelligence that I have ever known. That's astonishing coming from Henry James, because he didn't dole out those kinds of compliments very easily. And I love that the most complete man of genius, as distinct from fine intelligence. You know, you can have fine intelligence and not have genius. Genius is the thing. Intelligence is the gift of God, but genius is that special kiss of God upon a life, where someone is just given something beyond. And you see that when you see Yo-Yo Ma play the cello or Earl Scruggs play the 5-string banjo. It's genius. And that was Kipling, according to Henry James. Now, in one of his most famous stories, the novel Kim, he repeatedly calls Kim the little friend of the world. And everyone that knew him believed that that's how he viewed himself as a child, before he was damaged as a child. The little friend of the world. And I find that very poignant, don't you? The little friend of the world. In regard to his faith, as we shall see, in his maturity, he said, I am a God-fearing Christian atheist. Now that's the kind of thing you expect from a genius, because it leaves everyone scratching their heads. A God-fearing Christian atheist. So he went from being the little friend of the world to being a hater. One commentator has called him a nasty hater. He said there are good haters and nasty haters, and Kipling was a nasty hater. And this is someone who is fond of Kipling. And all of that because of the culture and because of his own experience. Now, let's talk for a brief time about the cultural background of God's funeral. And one of the victims of this is Joseph Rudyard Kipling. The cultural background is the British Empire, and the British Empire is a time of unparalleled wealth, affluence, and comfort and luxury. The finest made things in the world at that time were made in England. The finest made things in the world, whether they were furniture or jewelry or tools or machines, the finest made things in my collection of made things are from that period of the British Empire. And not only are they functionally wonderful, they're beautiful. Even hand tools, they're just beautiful. The use of rosewood, Brazilian rosewood, ebony, teak, other exotic woods, as well as the native hardwoods of Great Britain and America. It was a time of unusual luxury. And of course, the Victorian era is known for its luxurious settings, and you may have a personal taste for that kind of exuberance. Of course, the reaction to that was the arts and crafts movement that was bringing everything back to a more chaste view of design and work. But even the arts and crafts movement was, when you think of William Morris wallpaper, for example, only the wealthy could afford it. Only the wealthy can afford it today. You can still get it today. But only the wealthy could afford William Morris wallpaper from that period of time. But that's very important because of the biblical warnings again and again about excessive wealth and luxury. You know, one of the condemnations of the whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation is that list of luxurious items. It's repeated 2 or 3 times, isn't it, in the book of Revelation? That list of luxurious furniture and accessories, and you know, it's a condemnation of that. And of course, Proverbs 30 is saying to us, give me no more than I can handle. You know, don't let me be poor on the one hand, lest I steal and take your name in vain. But let me not become excessively wealthy, lest I forget thee. And so that affluence, that wealth, that level of luxury and comfort contributes to a godless society and culture. I think we see that today, don't we? Because, you know, and I think you can tell by the way I've already talked that I'm no enemy to beautiful things. But some people, that's all their life is beautiful things. There's nothing else there. And St. Paul says in a very trenchant verse, she who lives for pleasure is dead while she lives. So that's the kind of thing that was going on that led to God's funeral. With that came sensuality. Because, you know, it's only a luxurious society. By the way, the Latin word for lust and luxury come from the same root. It's interesting, isn't it? Luxuria is the deadly sin of lust. I am right about that, Anna. And so it's a very short distance between a luxurious lifestyle and a sensual lifestyle. And, you know, we can talk about the difference between sensuous and sensual, but there's a very fine line even there. And we always have to be on guard of those things because of our tendency toward lust and what St. Peter calls the corruption that is in the world through lust. And so it was a very sensual time. Things were being written, things were being drawn and painted that never would have been tolerated at the height of Victoria's reign. And there are a whole list of people I could mention in that regard. The The most famous example of that perhaps is Beardsley's pen and ink drawings of Lysistrata and other literary pieces that are pornographic as well as being sensual. And Beardsley died at a young age because of that sensual lifestyle of his, and he converted to the Roman Church in the end of his life and asked that all of his drawings be destroyed, but they were not. So it's a very sensual age. Edward VII, of course, is known for all of his mistresses and his sensual lifestyle, just the opposite of Victoria. And so that contributed to godlessness and to God's funeral. Scientism, and it is a word, and that's the exaltation of science over every other thing. And of course, that had begun in the 18th century, came to a head in the geological studies of Lyell, and then the works of Charles Darwin, and all those that followed in that time. And people began to worship science and began to poo-poo any kind of supernaturalism. They had discovered in the geological record that Genesis was wrong. And so they could give up Genesis. But as has often been my experience with people as a pastor and a friend, the problem is not what goes on from here up so often as it is what goes on from here down. I told that to a friend of mine once. I said, your problem is not from here up. Your problem is from here down. And he didn't take too kindly to that. But it was the truth. And that happened because of scientism. You see, once you give up, this is Romans 1:18 through 32, isn't it? That once you give up the truth of God, then you're given over to every kind of lust. And it just keeps needing a different kind of twist and kink. And so that scientism led to that as well. Does this remind you of our own time? Our own culture? The exaltation of science, whatever the hell that means. You know? Okay, it's all right. I saw her give me the jerk. Whatever the hell that means, because it can mean anything. Look at what we went through during the pandemic. We were bound to the scientists, whatever that meant. And so that's a problem. And of course, the empire brought multiculturalism into the life of the people. They suddenly found out that the English way of thinking in the shires was not the only way of thinking. The English way of loving was not the only way of loving. The English way of believing was not the only way of believing. There were many other alternatives in the world. So all of that contributed to what Wilson calls God's funeral. And Kipling was a part of all of that. Now, Kipling was not a promiscuous man as far as we know, but he did have a failed love affair early in his life that is treated in his novel The Light That Failed. And he did have a geisha mistress in Japan before his marriage. So that's a part of that whole Edwardian ethos and mindset. So it's not as if he were, and my goodness, we all know from watching Downton Abbey that they slept around as much as they possibly could sleep around, just like people do nowadays. They just were more discreet about it because of all the social pressures that were going on. But having said that, as a background to Kipling, there are more personal reasons that he called himself a God-fearing Christian atheist. And I think the profoundest of them all was his tragic childhood. Because he had a tragic child. He had a happy childhood where he was the little friend of the world. He was the little king of the family, the little prince. And then they sent him to England to live with the Hollways. And he went from light to darkness, from heaven to hell. And he encapsulated that in a story called Ba, Ba, Black Sheep. And of course you know the nursery rhyme, but he begins the story with the nursery rhyme. Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. 1 for the master, 1 for the dame, none for the little boy that cries down the lane. And he began to be the little boy that cried down the lane, with no wool, no attention except to be abused. I read this story, I put the note up here, the first time in July of 1979, and I read it again today. It broke my heart then, it broke my heart again today. Now this is a story, it's fictional, but it is based on that life. The children were sent to England. According to the story, there's some question that goes on between the father and the mother of the children called Punch and Judy in the story. And the mother's saying, can we be sure about these people? Well, they have good references, etc., etc. But as soon as the child, Punch, enters the household, he's immediately uncomfortable because he knows that he's in a hostile environment. And children are like that, you know, especially perceptive children, that they know when things are not right, even if they can't articulate that. And so he entered into what he would call for the rest of his life the house of desolation. And in addition to the abuse and the neglect and the abandonment that the children felt because their parents had sent them away, you know, that's often underplayed because we sympathize with the parents, but it's an act of abandonment to send children away. We've known missionary children all our lives that experienced that, haven't we? And we've known broken lives because of that all our lives and all our career. But in addition to the abuse and neglect was the fact that this woman that abused him was an evangelical Christian. And so young Punch, as he enters this home, having come from faith and trust and love and adoration and respect from his parents and his Indian mothers, writes, when a matured man discovers that he has been deserted by providence, deprived of his God, and cast without help, comfort, or sympathy upon a world which is new and strange to him, his despair, which may find expression in evil living, the writing of his experiences, or the more satisfactory diversion of suicide, is generally supposed to be impressive. A child, under exactly similar circumstances as far as its knowledge goes, cannot very well curse God and die. It howls till its nose is red, its eyes are sore, its head aches. Punch and Judy, through no fault of their own, had lost all their world. They sat in the hall and cried. The black-haired boy looking on from afar. Now that's experience speaking, don't you think? In the second bag of the 3 bags of the story, he writes this. Because the woman calls him black sheep, black sheep, black sheep. She locks him in his room without food. She locks him in the basement. She locks him in closets. She beats him. There is a child, an older boy in the family that bullies him and the other girl. And so they begin to hate. You know, whenever fear exists, hate grows. You know, guilt will always lead to certain things. Shame will always lead to certain things. Fear will always lead to certain things. Guilt will lead to obsession. Shame will lead to deceit. And fear will lead to hatred. Infallibly. That's the way we're made. And so they learn to hate. They learn to deceive. They learn to obsess. And then there's this. This lapse was excusable because in the interval, he had been introduced by Auntie Rosa to 2 very impressive things. An abstraction called God, the intimate friend and ally of Auntie Rosa, generally believed to live behind the kitchen range because it was hot there, and a dirty brown book filled with unintelligible dots and marks. Punch was always anxious to oblige everybody. He therefore welded a story of the creation onto what he could recollect of his Indian fairy tales and scandalized Auntie Rosa by repeating the result to Judy. It was a sin, a grievous sin, and Punch was talked to for a quarter of an hour. He could not understand where the iniquity came in, but was careful not to repeat the offense, because Auntie Rosa told him that God had heard every word he had said and was very angry. If this were true, why didn't God come and say so, thought Punch, and dismissed the matter from his mind. And here's the thing I remember from 1979. Afterward, he learned to know the Lord as the only thing in the world more awful than Auntie Rosa, as a creature that stood in the background and counted the strokes of the cane. Now, if that doesn't break your heart, nothing will. And let us remember that there are children in Rockwell right now that are experiencing such things. And that is Rudyard Kipling. He ends the story this way. There's a little ray of hope, but not much. But we do want to end on that note. This is the last paragraph of the story. Not altogether, O Punch, for when young lips have drunk deep of the bitter waters of hate, suspicion, and despair, all the love in the world will not wholly take away that knowledge, though it may turn darkened eyes for a while to the light and teach faith where no faith was. Oh my goodness. Now I think that is the core of Rudyard Kipling. I think it's undeniable, and I'm not alone in thinking that. Because what happens in the life of an abused and neglected child? What is the fruit of all of this evil? Let's call it evil, because it is, isn't it? And the fact that it's religious evil makes it even more evil. The life of the neglected and abused child can be summed up in these things: the need for attention and affection. Kathy has a new child that has been being fostered by one of our families, and she's an abused and neglected child. And she just clings to everyone who comes around her. We have to say, no, not that way. Don't cling that way. And we love on her and we touch her, but she's clingy because she's so needy. And all of that comes from their need of the proof of worth. They're seeking proof of worth. Tell me I'm worthy of love. Tell me I'm worthy of care. Very often, an abused child becomes a solitary child, a child of solitude. They live inside their own heads. They make their own little lives. Very often they become obsessive about carefully arranging and ordering their little possessions so that the rest of the house may be a complete disaster, and you go into the space that is theirs and everything is ordered in that little solitary space. I was complaining once to one of our friends, a pastor and a counselor, and I said, why are my kids such slobs? All my kids are slobs. And he said, that's because they live in a secure environment. They don't have to worry about things. They don't have to prove anything. And they've since grown out of that. Well, most of them have. Most of them have. And so they develop a solitary life. They begin to develop a life inside their heads. And of course, that's where these stories come from, and where drawings come from, and creativity comes from that hurt and that solitude. They're children of intense sensitivity. They can also be children of intense cruelty, and those things are not mutually exclusive. They can be very, very sensitive and yet cruel. And that brings me to the love-hate thing, because it's related to a question of language, of egoism and egotism. You're familiar with that, the difference? It's very pedantic academic difference. Usually you're talking about a creep, whether he's an egoist or an egotist. An egoist, by definition, is someone who's just a self-centered, self-absorbed, selfish person. An egotist, on the other hand, is someone who feels their own importance, but they're not necessarily selfish. They can be very generous. And that sensitive, cruel child can be very generous on the one hand, and very egotistical on the other hand. There are no broad lines between these things. They very often intermarry with one another. The abused, neglected child is always struggling with faith and trust and mistrust. Do I trust you? Do I trust you? They don't trust me. And sometimes they don't trust anyone, and that develops into a sociopathic personality. And they are egoists. They're completely self-absorbed. They're completely cruel. They're completely sensual. They're completely given over to their own lust and desires and ambitions and goals because they don't trust anybody. This is very grim stuff, isn't it? And you know what often comes from this? And this was true. All of these things were true of Rudyard Kipling. All of them. The need for attention and affection. The proof of worth. The need for proof of worth. The solitary life. that sensitivity that bordered upon pain at times, as you can tell, even from the very brief thing if you've read his poems, and you were talking about loving his poems, all of this was true of him. But very often in the life of an abused, neglected child, there is what appeared in Kipling, and that is the goal to build a family. To have what I never had. To be what was never been to me. And so he devoted himself in his marriage to Carrie, to building a family. And they had those 3 children. And he was, by all testimony, not only a lover of his own family, but a lover of children. And children loved him. And you'd see photographs of him, which are quite unusual for the time, sitting on the floor playing with children. You know, that was not normal in Edwardian times. And so there was that devotion to children. And as we read all of this, what are you thinking of when it comes to the Gospels? What did Jesus say about people who abuse children? He said they ought to have a millstone tied around their necks and dropped out in the middle of that leg. That's harsh. You get on the news and say that about the mayor, and you'll realize how harsh that is. And so, but not too harsh in light of what I've said to you. So let's move. And sadly, in certain ways, it doesn't get better. Because Josephine, named after her father, and was born only a day after or before her father's birthday, and who was the origin of the Just So stories, because he would tell her stories at night, and he would change a word and she'd say, "No, tell it just so, please." That's where the phrase comes from. You know how children are. You know, if you tell them the story of Peter Rabbit and change Mr. McGillicuddy, is that his name? What? McGregor to Mr. McGillicuddy, then a 3-year-old's going to say, "Not McGillicuddy." Just so, please, just so. So that's where the stories came from. And he adored her, and she adored her father, and they both contracted pneumonia, and she died from it. And they kept the news of that 6-year-old's death from him for 2 weeks, fearing that it would cause a relapse on his part. He never recovered from that. And so the wounds that were already in his psyche, in the depths of his person, were just made deeper. And then, of course, after all of his fame and all of his success, he was a very wealthy man. He would be a multi-millionaire by today's standards, with all the honors. And, you know, I find it fascinating. He didn't have a university education. Fascinating. But he was awarded, you know, Oxford didn't receive him because of his grades, but he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Oxford on the same day that Mark Twain was awarded the same degree. They were there together, and they were off smoking cigars in the corner where no one could see them. They could smell them but not see them. Because they told them, no smoking, no smoking. So Mark Twain said to Kipling, "Come over here, I've got something to show you." And he took out these big stogies. And there's a photograph of them smoking together. And they already knew one another because in his American travels, Kipling had stopped in Elmira, New York, and knocked on Twain's door without any kind of prior introduction. And they spent 2 hours together, and they enjoyed one another's company. And so without a university education, and I'm told that whole set is the works of Rudyard Kipling up there. So look at that. You see, all of that's the result of that description of the neglected, abused little boy. He had a lot to prove, and he proved it. He had a lot to lose, and those losses were great. They were not complete. After all of his success, his son, who was by then about 20, World War I was raging. The boy wanted to go to war like all the young Englishmen wanted to go to war at the time. But he had bad eyesight like his father and grandfather before him, so he was rejected. But he begged his father to pull strings, so he did, and he knew people. And the boy was sent over there and died after a very short time in battle. Have you seen my son Jack? The poem goes. And goes on to say, the wind will not bring him back. The tide will not bring him back. You have 3 children. To lose one of them is unspeakable. To lose 2, to have 1 remaining, just incomprehensible, isn't it? So you see, God knows the inroads of the heart. And the one who will finally judge Joseph Rudyard Kipling is a true man who has been abused and rejected and neglected and harmed and finally killed. And he is the one who will sit and judge that man. And he will know with precision every twist and turn that brought him to unbelief or faith or a mixture of the two. Aren't you glad that's true? And while we can look at that life and we can look at these tragic lives, and the list is just heartbreaking. Thomas Hardy, John Ruskin. I could tell you, I could spend hours just talking to you about John Ruskin and his loss of faith. And it's very poignant to me. It's a very real thing to me. Because most of us have struggled with our faith. One of my dear, dear friends wrote me today after we lost one of our Edgemere people in the plane crash last Saturday. He said, "This, just watching this over and over again is, it's really challenged my faith in God." And I said, yes, of course it has. It's impossible not for it to. But I said, remember, without God's prevenient grace, the whole world would look like Chernobyl. God is very gracious. We're sitting here enjoying one another. I trust you're enjoying me. So here's the application I would make in this regard. Oh, how we need to protect our children on every level. Now, I know we can't do everything for them. We can't always be there, and even sometimes we're the problem. Sometimes even when we're there, we're part of the problem, right? But we need so much to be vigilant for our children and grandchildren, and be vigilant of our children who have children and save them. I'm not wanting to intrude, but I do want to caution you. I think that's a dangerous thing you're permitting there. And we especially need to be careful with them, with strangers who are unvetted and unknown and unreferenced, because that's where the abuse always starts. One of the things I'm so thankful for at St. Timothy's School at the Chapel of the Cross Reformed Episcopal Church is that we're all watchers. We're all watchers. If anyone comes around, he's being watched. She's being watched. Now, we're not unkind about it, but we do watch. And anything untoward or out of the ordinary or creepy, or sticky, as one of our friends calls it, it's immediately brought to the attention of the principal and the headmaster, and so forth and so on. So these children, that just never should have happened. Never should have happened. And the second thing I think that the life of Kipling tells us is that what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his soul? Because he had all the honors. He and Twain are very similar. Now, I can't say, no one can say this about Kipling because he was very guarded about what he wrote about religion. That's why he gives us that ambivalent answer to what is your religion? I am a God-fearing Christian atheist. Twain also was cautious because of the culture and times, but in his private writings, Twain was a God-hater. Twain hated God. He believed in God. He was not an atheist. But I guess it was Albert Camus who said, if there is a God, he's the devil. And Twain would certainly have agreed with that. He hated God. And I don't think we can say that about Kipling. But they did resonate with one another. They both were at maximum. Twain was the most famous American writer in the world of his time. Kipling was the most famous English writer in the world at the time. They're both immensely wealthy, though Twain, of course, had money issues his whole life. But immensely wealthy. They lived extraordinarily comfortable, even luxurious lives. And they lived to relatively old age. Kipling finally succumbed to a stomach ulcer, which probably also tells us something, about his inner life, doesn't it? That the stomach ulcer finally killed him. And he suffered horribly in the last years of his life from that. And I get the impression, I certainly know this about Twain because I just finished 3 or 4 years of reading this massive new academic biography in 3 volumes of Twain, that he is not somebody I would want to know. As much as I chuckle and enjoy, I enjoy Huckleberry Finn every time I read it. But personally, he is not someone you'd want to know. And I don't know about whether I'd say that about Kipling or not. Now, the last thing I'd say, and I'll give you a little testimony, if I can, because this has broken up the fountains of my deep. There's so many parallels and resonances in my life with this man, because I, too, lived in a house of desolation from the time I was 9 until I was 13. And I had a wicked and an abusive and a sadistic stepmother. And the house I lived in was at 408 North Howard in Gainesville, Texas. That's how clear it was in my mind. And after I was grown and married, I never went back to Gainesville, Texas. And any time we came to Fort Worth or Dallas, we'd have to go down 35 from Oklahoma to go to Dallas or to Fort Worth. And we'd never stop. I had family there, but we'd never stop. And that went on for years. And Kathy would ask me, why don't you stop and see Uncle John or stop and see Aunt Mary Lou? I said, well, I'll call them. But I couldn't bear to go back. And so finally one day, we were going down, and I said, we'll go. And we drove over to the House of Desolation. And I sat in the car, a 40-year-old man, and bawled like a baby. Just being there. Just being there. And of course, Kathy comforted me and encouraged me. But it was a horrible, because the old thing was still there. It was just the same. The whole thing was just the same. So years passed. I don't know how many, 4 or 5 probably. And we went back. And we drove down Howth Street. And the place was completely cleared. It's like they'd taken a bulldozer and just cleared it off, just stripped it down to the ground. Even the trees my father planted were cut down and gone. And I sat there in peace. Because it had been cleared from my heart before I even came back the second time. I'd gone through some counseling and had some very sensitive counselors. And I had Kathy always my support and her forbearance incredible. But it all had come to pass, cleared away by the Christian grace of forgiveness. That I had come to forgive that sadistic, cruel, tragic, alcoholic woman. And when that land was cleared, it was no cleaner than my heart. St. Paul in Titus, that was one of our readings this past week, wasn't it? In Titus 3. He talks about this world, and he describes it by saying, for we were once servants of various lusts and desires, hateful and hating one another. But after that the grace of God that bringeth salvation appeared, not by works of righteousness which we have done. The Son of God appeared. The grace of God appeared, teaching us to live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. By the grace of regeneration, that we can be transformed, and we can be healed, and we can look at the house of desolation as a place where we were hurt, we were even harmed, but we were not destroyed. Because God was in our lives already, holding us. We had neighbors there that were funny people. They lived behind us, and I played with their son. And I loved to eat with them because it was a hot meal and it was away from all the turmoil. And they were godly Christian people. They were a little charismatic. And Carol Ledbetter and Mr. Ledbetter's daddy were up on the roof one day. And I walked across our backyard to go see their son Marlon. And old Mr. Ledbetter said, Carol, who's that kid? Who's that boy? He said, well, that's Tommy Smith. He said, he's Jim Pat's son. He said, Carol, that boy's going to preach the gospel of grace one of these days. Now, how do you explain that? So you see, God was holding me. And you forgive me all the personal references tonight. Well, I couldn't help it, and I really am not apologizing. Okay, I'm done.
You're not done because we're going to take some questions.
That's good.
Thoughts, questions?
You sort of alluded to it, but as you're telling the story, I wonder if he ever got back to his father, Kipling, and that dissonance, was that ever resolved? I mean, his father's still there, I mentioned, but
They apparently had a loving relationship as long as the old man lived. You know, it was his father who got him the newspaper job after his travel in England and after he was rejected at the university. And there's a beautiful photograph on Wikipedia of the two of them, of the mature older man, who's I expect about my age, 70 or so, and a young Kipling who's 20, probably 20 something at the time. And apparently, one of the things that happened is that an aunt, Kipling, would go and visit an aunt who was married to Edward Burne-Jones, the pre-Raphaelite painter. And that was a salvation to him when he'd go stay with them for a month in the summer holidays. He'd get away from the house of desolation. And she came in one night to tell him good night, and when she leaned over the bed, he put his hand up like this, you know, to ward off a blow. So she immediately telegraphed his mother and said, there's something wrong going on here. His mother got on a ship and went immediately to England, took them away from the Holloways, and began to rebuild the relationship. And then the children went back to India with her. And so there's no sense in anything I've read that there was a bad or a strained relationship between Kipling and his parents. I don't think a child under those circumstances can help but to feel abandoned. I don't think it's possible. I think that's asking too much of human nature. But apparently they had a good final relationship.
Questions?
the other thing I was thinking about was C.S. Lewis had some pretty bleak
Oh, yeah.
periods in his life. And you have C.S.
Yes.
Lewis and you have
There are parallels,
Kipling.
aren't there?
And I don't think C.S. Lewis's parents or father was not the loving
No.
one that, and yet they ended up so far apart.
They ended up in a kind of, Lewis and his father ended up in a kind of separate peace, as it were.
Détente.
Détente. That they would never understand one another. They would never be intimate with one another, but there was no longer any hostility. But I hadn't thought, Lewis, the week before he died, wrote a letter in which he said, forgiveness is the hardest thing. He said, I only this week found grace to forgive a schoolmaster who abused me when I was a small boy. And he was 63 or 4 at that point. And isn't that encouraging? And, he's struggling with that his whole life, but he finally came to forgiveness and peace even with that. And then he died several days later. So take heart, dear friends. Really what I'm trying to say to you tonight through this gloomy story is there's so much hope for us. I hope that came across. There's so much hope because of Jesus and the resurrection.
The other, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Nobody else is talking.
One of my gifts. The other thing we know is that MKs and PKs, your concept of God is informed initially mostly by your experience with your Father.
Mm-hmm.
Our Father who art in heaven, the Father who's supposed to protect and provide, and so on, as we see. But with MKs and PKs, you've got the Father who is out there doing wonderful things, who's, praise God, who's teaching things, who's helping people, saving people, but is not there, is distant, and not there to take care of them. So you get the concept of God as being this wonderful person that's out there, but